James Cooper had never been the kind of man who believed in luck. His life had been shaped by discipline, planning, and a deep respect for structure, things he had come to rely on in his 30 years of work as a structural engineer. After retiring early due to burnout and mounting health concerns, he and his wife Evelyn decided to make a change, leaving behind the chaos of city life and settling into what was supposed to be their final home in the quiet hills of Silvermount Ridge, a small, upscale neighborhood tucked just outside the county line. The move wasn't spontaneous. It had been in the works for over a year, and the house, a modest but beautifully kept brick colonial with wraparound porch and enough yard for Evelyn's gardening plans, had been scouted, inspected, and paid for in full. Everything, on paper, was secure. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter. Peaceful, predictable. Evelyn Cooper, unlike James, had lived a life in the field. She had served in law enforcement for 20 years, rising through the ranks to become the county sheriff, a role she never pursued for status, but out of a relentless belief in order and fairness. She had never been one for politics, and after 2 decades of internal affairs investigations, courthouse dramas, and late-night calls about things no one should ever have to see, she requested a formal leave of absence. Not retirement, not a resignation, just space. She needed time to breathe, to process, to exist without her badge dictating the terms of every room she walked into. James had supported the decision wholeheartedly. They had both been through their storms, and now, for once, they wanted the quiet kind of life most people take for granted. The first week in Silvermount Ridge was uneventful, in the best possible way. They spent their time unpacking, repainting cabinets, putting up shelving, and arguing gently over whether or not the backyard needed a second tool shed. Evelyn spent early mornings sipping black coffee on the porch swing, eyes trained on the horizon like it was her old patrol beat. James made a habit of walking the property line each evening, measuring distances no one asked him to measure, as if reaffirming they truly belonged there. They kept to themselves. They nodded politely to neighbors who passed by, though few ever stopped to speak beyond the obligatory welcome wave. The only person who seemed eager to make contact was a woman named Karen Meeks. She appeared at their front door on a Thursday afternoon, clipboard in hand, smile too wide to be casual. She introduced herself as Neighborhood Coordinator and handed James a thick packet labeled Silvermount Community Standards, which included everything from lawn height regulations to acceptable curtain colors. Her tone was sweet but clipped, like a kindergarten teacher explaining rules to an unruly child. James thanked her and promised to read the packet. Evelyn remained silent, watching the woman closely. Something about her demeanor felt manufactured. She spoke in legal phrasing. Words like compliance and non-negotiable clauses rolled off her tongue too easily for a self-proclaimed volunteer. 2 days later, Evelyn parked her vehicle, an unmarked county-issued SUV, in their own driveway. They had no garage yet. It was part of their renovation plan, scheduled for the following month. That night they found a neon-colored notice wedged under the windshield wiper. Parking violation. Prohibited vehicle class. See Article 4B of Residential Vehicle Policy. Evelyn frowned. James, flipping through the packet Karen had left, found the clause. It stated that government-marked or tactical-looking vehicles must be stored out of public view to preserve the aesthetic standard of the community. Evelyn's SUV wasn't marked. It had no sirens, no lights, no county stickers. It looked like any other utility vehicle save for the reinforced front grille. James considered calling Karen to clarify, but Evelyn, ever measured, suggested they wait. "Let's just watch," she said, not in paranoia, but in practiced caution. She had learned over decades that first impressions in power games rarely revealed the full picture. The next morning, another notice appeared, this time taped to their front door. Second notice of violation. Driveway use infraction. Resolution required within 72 hours to avoid formal escalation. No contact name, no phone number, just the Silvermount header and a stamped seal. That evening, Karen returned, unannounced. This time, she brought along a man in a polo shirt with the words "Neighborhood Enforcement" embroidered across the chest. They stood at the edge of the property, refusing to step onto the porch and asked to speak with the registered homeowner. Evelyn met them at the steps. James remained behind her, silent. Karen, still smiling, gestured to the SUV. "Unfortunately, this vehicle is in violation of Silvermount's appearance standards. We've received a few complaints." Evelyn didn't blink. "From whom?" she asked. Karen paused. "Complaints remain anonymous for safety." Evelyn looked at the man beside her. He said nothing, eyes darting toward the road like a kid waiting for an adult to take over. "We'll need to see your occupancy approval," Karen continued, "and proof of vehicle registration. You should have submitted them upon arrival. It's standard protocol." Evelyn folded her arms. "No one mentioned that in your welcome packet." Karen's expression faltered for half a breath. "That was more of a courtesy guide. This is an official request." The tension hung in the air like static. Evelyn, despite everything in her wanting to end it right there, chose silence. "You can leave your request in writing," she said calmly. "I won't be producing personal documents at my doorstep." Karen didn't argue. She only turned with a practiced sigh and walked away, but not before muttering, "Non-compliance will lead to escalation." That phrase sat with James for the rest of the night. He wasn't used to being policed. Not like this. He had spent a lifetime following rules, making sense of systems, calculating risk. But this was something else. It wasn't law. It wasn't even reason. It was theater, performance power. And the more he looked into the fine print of the Silvermount guidelines, the more he realized how deeply these structures were built, not on logic, but on implication, intimidation, and social choreography. Evelyn, for her part, remained quiet. Not because she was afraid, but because she was watching, calculating, waiting for a line to be crossed. That line arrived the following Monday, when Evelyn returned from a supply run to find a tow truck idling in front of their driveway. The driver looked confused, even apologetic. "Got a service call to remove an unauthorized vehicle," he said, holding up a clipboard. "Came through the dispatch." Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She simply walked to the vehicle, opened the door, pulled out her ID badge, and handed it to the driver. He read it once, twice, then stepped back and said, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I'm just doing what the work order said." She nodded. "You've done nothing wrong. But tell whoever sent you they've made a mistake." Karen watched the whole thing from across the street, arms folded, lips curled into something between a smirk and a dare. Evelyn turned to James as the truck pulled away and said quietly, "It's starting." And James, for the first time since they arrived, felt something shift in his gut, an understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't just about a car or a policy or a patch of asphalt. It was about control, power, and the lengths to which some people will go to maintain it. They had moved to Silvermount for peace, but peace, it seemed, would have to be earned. 3 days passed without further incident, but James could sense something in the air, like a current building beneath still water. He had spent years analyzing the subtle stress points in physical structures, beams under pressure, joints misaligned by fractions of an inch. But this was something less tangible and far more corrosive. Evelyn carried herself with the same calm resolve she always had, but James knew her well enough to recognize the precision with which she now observed the neighborhood. What cars parked where and when, which windows remained lit late into the night, who slowed when passing their house, who sped up. The SUV stayed parked in the driveway. Not because they were being defiant, though that assumption was certainly being made, but because there was nowhere else to put it without conceding to nonsense. Their garage remodel hadn't even started yet. It was their driveway, their property. But the peace they hoped for was already unraveling, fiber by fiber. On a rainy Thursday morning, the air heavy and thick with the scent of wet soil, James walked out to collect the mail and noticed the mailbox was open, the lid left hanging like a gaping mouth. Inside, along with a waterlogged grocery ad and a utility bill, was a folded manila envelope with no return address. His name was written across the front in block letters. Not typed, handwritten with odd pressure. Something in his gut told him not to open it on the porch. Instead, he brought it inside, laid it on the dining room table, and waited for Evelyn to return from her morning errands. When she arrived, she didn't even remove her coat before she saw his expression and asked, "What happened?" James gestured to the envelope. "Found this in the mailbox. No stamp. Someone walked it up." Evelyn opened it carefully. Inside were 2 photographs, grainy, black and white, clearly printed from a low-quality surveillance camera. One showed her getting out of her SUV in the driveway. The other was a shot taken from behind a fence, capturing her standing by the side gate, hand on the latch, head turned toward the street. Between the 2 photos was a single sheet of paper, typed in a sterile Times New Roman font. It read, "All residents are expected to comply with the standards outlined in the Silvermount Policy document. Further violations will be documented. Repeated non-compliance may result in forced resolution under Community Code." No signature, no letterhead, just a sterile threat dressed as formality. They sat in silence for a long moment. James broke it first. "This is intimidation, plain and simple." Evelyn nodded, folding the letter precisely and placing it back in the envelope. "It's not official. They want us to think it is. Whoever's doing this, they're careful. But they're not smart enough to realize they just gave us proof." She made a phone call that afternoon, not to her department and not in her capacity as a law enforcement officer. She called the county administrator's office and asked for the name of the legal counsel assigned to Silvermount Ridge. The voice on the other end hesitated, then gave her the name of a third-party property firm based in downtown Raleigh. Evelyn thanked them and hung up. She then called that firm directly and asked if they were aware of any current active disputes involving the Cooper residence. The clerk put her on hold. When they returned, the answer was as expected. No formal violations had been filed and no legal proceedings were pending or scheduled. In short, the letter they received was a bluff. But, bluff or not, someone had entered their property to take those photographs. That night, James rewired the motion lights on the front of the house and repositioned the small floodlight above the side gate. Evelyn locked the SUV for the first time in weeks and moved a spare set of keys to a firebox in the master closet. There was no panic in their movements, just a careful return to old habits, the kind born out of a quiet readiness for whatever came next. But they didn't speak about it over dinner. They didn't want to give it power. The next escalation came 2 days later, during a brief stretch of sunlight between passing storms. Evelyn had gone into town for groceries, and James was cleaning up the flower beds when he noticed a white sedan slow to a crawl in front of their house. The driver, a man in his 30s, clean-shaven and dressed in a sharp navy windbreaker, rolled down the window and raised a phone. James stepped out from the side yard, rake in hand, and locked eyes with him. The man lowered the phone slowly, nodded once, and then drove away without a word. No plates on the front of the car. James walked back inside and jotted down the make, model, and what he could remember of the rear plate. That evening, they were preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. Standing on the porch was Karen Meeks, her hair perfectly styled, clipboard in one hand, small digital camera in the other. Her smile was tight. "Evening," she said. "I was hoping to speak with the homeowner regarding an unresolved parking infraction." Evelyn stepped forward without hesitation. "I'm the homeowner." Karen hesitated, then glanced at her clipboard. Actually, our records show this property is registered under James Cooper. Evelyn didn't blink. We are joint owners. You can speak with me. Karen shifted slightly, her smile freezing at the corners. Very well. I just wanted to let you know we've scheduled a formal vehicle inspection for Tuesday morning. It's a simple process. Our compliance representative will arrive between 8 and 10 a.m. to verify that your vehicle is within guidelines. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Vehicle inspection? This isn't the DMV. Karen's tone remained sweet, but her eyes flickered with something sharper. It's in accordance with the Silvermount Appearance bylaws. We've had several complaints. From whom? I'm not at liberty to say. James stepped into view behind Evelyn, his presence quiet but firm. Then we're not at liberty to permit strangers access to our property. You're not law enforcement. If anyone steps onto this property without cause or a court order, I will treat it as trespassing. Understood. Karen blinked twice, her mouth parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. Finally, she lowered her clipboard and said, Refusal to cooperate may be documented as non-compliance. Then she turned and walked away, back straight, heels clicking down the porch steps. As the door closed behind her, Evelyn exhaled through her nose. They're escalating, trying to bait us into something they can use. James nodded. You think they'll actually send someone? They might, but not for a real inspection. They're looking for a reaction. And sure enough, on Tuesday morning at exactly 8:06 a.m., a black SUV parked across the street. Two men in gray jackets stepped out, holding tablets. They stood on the sidewalk, never approaching the house, just tapping on their screens and occasionally pointing toward the driveway. After 15 minutes, they got back into the vehicle and left. No interaction, no notice, no explanation. That night, Evelyn received a call. Not from her department, but from someone she hadn't heard from in nearly a year. A former colleague. The voice on the other end was quiet but deliberate. Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up. Someone filed a background inquiry under your name with the state credentialing database. Flagged it as a request from an oversight committee. Problem is, there's no such committee listed in your area. Evelyn said nothing at first. Then, slowly, they're trying to dig, discredit, build something out of nothing. Do you want me to run it up the flag? No, she said, not yet. Because she knew how this would look. If she retaliated now, it would only feed the narrative Karen and her ilk were constructing, that Evelyn was an authority figure who thought herself above rules. She wasn't. She never had been. But she also knew when people stopped playing by the rules and started using them as weapons. James stood at the window that evening, watching the streetlights flicker on. His voice was quiet. I think we're past diplomacy. Evelyn nodded slowly. Then we go by the book. Every step, and we make sure the book is on our side. The tension in Silvermount Ridge no longer simmered quietly beneath the surface. It had begun to seep into the open like gas from a slow leak, invisible yet unmistakably present. James felt it in the way neighbors now avoided eye contact, in the sudden, unnatural quiet that fell whenever he stepped outside. Evelyn felt it too, but she wore her awareness like armor, quiet, polished, never boastful. Their lives, once structured around peaceful routines of coffee and gardening, now unfolded in calculated measures. Who locked up last? Who checked the perimeter before bed? Who reviewed the new additions to the so-called community bulletin that showed up weekly on their doorstep? Each paper came unsigned, though clearly curated by Karen and her circle. Thinly veiled gossip disguised as neighborhood updates, where concerned citizens lamented the growing resistance to shared standards and increasing defiance of cooperative values. It was bureaucratic character assassination, crafted by people who had never known a real threat in their lives. The real escalation began not with an attack, but with something more subtle: an absence. One morning, James walked out to discover that their trash bins had not been collected. Every other house on the street had cleanly emptied containers lined up at the curb. Theirs remained full. When he called the Waste Management Service, he was told that their property had been flagged as temporarily removed from service due to inconsistent access. James pressed the operator, but all she could say was that the order had come from the community liaison. Evelyn, already dressed for the day, stood silently as he relayed the conversation. She didn't speak until he hung up. Then, simply, "They're testing how much they can cut off." Within a week, more inconveniences piled up. Deliveries were inexplicably delayed. A contractor they had scheduled to begin work on the garage never showed, later apologizing and explaining that he had been told the job was postponed by the homeowners association. Of course, there was no formal association, at least not in any legal sense, just Karen's informal but aggressively organized network which functioned more like a shadow regime. Evelyn kept a running log of each incident. Dates, times, contacts. She wasn't building a case, not yet, but she was preparing for the possibility that one would need to be built. Her patience was not infinite, but it was deeply disciplined, shaped by years of courtrooms and depositions. James, meanwhile, wrestled with a different kind of frustration. His sense of protection had always been practical. Build a wall, reinforce the gate, fix what breaks. But now he found himself in a conflict that could not be solved with tools or blueprints. He wanted to strike back, not violently, but firmly, to shame them publicly, to expose them. Evelyn, however, insisted they move deliberately. "If you respond emotionally," she told him one night, "they'll say we overreacted. They want us to act out so they can justify everything they've done. Let them show who they are first." That strategy was tested sooner than expected. Late one afternoon, James returned from the hardware store to find a tow truck idling at the curb. The same SUV Evelyn had parked in their driveway for weeks was already hooked up, the front wheels lifted. A man in reflective gear stood beside the cab, clipboard in hand, staring at James with weary resignation. James approached, already feeling heat rise in his chest. "Put it down," he said. "That's my vehicle. This is private property." The man didn't flinch. "Work order came through this morning. Says vehicle is unauthorized. Gotta take it." "Who authorized it?" The man shrugged. "Came from the enforcement coordinator. Karen Meeks, right? Says the car's been under community dispute." Before James could respond, Evelyn stepped out the front door. Her voice was calm but unmistakably commanding. "Lower the vehicle. Now." The man hesitated. Evelyn held up her wallet, opened it, revealed her identification, not as a homeowner, but as the current sheriff of the county. "Ma'am, I didn't," he began, but she cut him off. "I'm not accusing you of anything. You were given false authority. If you move that vehicle another inch, you'll be part of a civil dispute you don't want to be involved in." That was all it took. The driver, clearly just doing his job, released the hydraulics and unhooked the vehicle. He apologized again, then drove off quickly. Evelyn remained still for a moment, watching the truck disappear down the street. They didn't speak until she came back inside. James turned to her, voice low. "This isn't just pressure anymore. That was coordinated." Evelyn nodded. "It's harassment." That evening, she made a formal report. Not through her department. She couldn't, not without raising issues of conflict, but through the proper administrative channel for inter-residential disputes. She submitted records, cited misrepresentations, and formally requested a review of Silvermount Ridge's internal operations, especially regarding the delegation of authority. She knew it wouldn't bring instant results, but it would put everything under the microscope, and under a microscope, falsehoods rot quickly. What followed was the beginning of an information war. Karen began circulating printed incident summaries. accusing Evelyn of misusing her position, suggesting that her conduct should be reviewed, and encouraging neighbors to voice concern to local authorities before matters escalate further. The language was lawyered within an inch of its life, careful not to accuse, but pointed enough to poison. Flyers appeared on porches overnight. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Harriet, later confessed she saw someone slipping them onto steps at 2 a.m. but was too nervous to intervene. What struck Evelyn wasn't the malice. It was the efficiency. Karen had built a network over years. She had time, influence, and more than anything, she had built a culture where people were afraid to stand against her. But not everyone. Slowly, small signs of support began to emerge. An anonymous note left in their mailbox read, "We're with you. She's been doing this for years." Another neighbor, an older man with a limp, approached James while taking out the trash and muttered, "Don't let her win." The last couple moved out. She thinks she owns us. Evelyn didn't respond emotionally. Instead, she requested a meeting, not with Karen, but with the county's neutral ombudsman, who handled disputes between private citizens and unregulated neighborhood groups. The request was accepted, and a date was set. In the meantime, they braced for whatever Karen would try next. They didn't have to wait long. One afternoon, returning from a drive into town, James noticed a van parked in front of their driveway. The side read, "Municipal Infrastructure Services." 2 men were inspecting the curb and storm drain. James approached. "Can I help you?" One of them looked up. "You live here?" "Yes." "We've been asked to evaluate a potential drainage violation. Says your driveway might be channeling water improperly into the community runoff." James blinked. "That's absurd. Our property has been up to code since before we moved in." The man shrugged. "We're just here for the inspection. Orders came in last night." Karen Meeks signed the request. That night, Evelyn didn't just log the event. She submitted a formal request for the suspension of all external evaluations until the ombudsman meeting was held. Within 24 hours, a notice was delivered to their home from the county office. All third-party assessments initiated by residents without municipal approval were to cease immediately pending review. It was a small victory, but it broke something. Karen, who had never been directly named in any of Evelyn's filings, now found herself the subject of a quiet investigation. What began as personal animus was now in the crosshairs of county oversight. And still, she didn't back down. Instead, she made it clear, without ever saying it aloud, that she would not lose. That this was her territory, her rules. That Evelyn's presence was not only unwanted, but intolerable. What Karen had not accounted for was the one truth Evelyn knew better than anyone. If you push someone who understands the law, who respects it and lives by it, far enough, if you weaponize rules against those sworn to uphold them, you don't just provoke a reaction. You provoke precision, and precision always cuts clean. The morning of the ombudsman meeting arrived not with a bang, but with an almost unnerving stillness. Evelyn rose early, dressed in plain slacks and a navy blouse, her badge and sidearm locked in the fireproof cabinet she rarely opened now. She wasn't attending the meeting as Sheriff Cooper. She was attending as Evelyn, private citizen, homeowner, and target of an increasingly calculated harassment campaign. James made her coffee, the same way he always did. 2 sugars, no cream, and sat across from her at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around his own mug like it was something warm he could hold on to, some stable anchor in the shifting sands of neighborhood war. They didn't speak much that morning, not out of fear, but focus. They both knew the significance of what was about to happen. The meeting wasn't just a procedural step, it was a declaration, a line drawn not in threat, but in process. It was, in many ways, their refusal to kneel. The ombudsman's office was located in a modest brick building nestled between the tax assessor and the county registrar. a place people usually entered reluctantly and left exhausted. But the moment Evelyn stepped inside, her presence reset the energy of the room. Not because of anything she did overtly, but because even stripped of title and uniform, she carried herself with a discipline that couldn't be faked. The ombudsman, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s named Rosalind, greeted them professionally and invited them into the small but functional conference room. On the table sat 3 folders, one for the Coopers, one for the office, and one marked Community Records Submitted. Evelyn didn't need to open the third to know it was curated by Karen. Rosalind started the session by laying out the scope. They would review the submitted complaints, cross-reference them with municipal codes and neighborhood policy records, and determine whether a formal warning or injunction was warranted. Evelyn nodded, James remained quiet, and Rosalind opened the folder. What followed was a parade of paperwork. Letters citing non-compliance, photos of the SUV in the driveway, anonymously written statements alleging a disruptive presence, and even a map of the property annotated with red circles around problem areas, all unsigned, all lacking substance. Evelyn listened, took notes, and when prompted, responded with the clarity of someone used to depositions. She didn't raise her voice, didn't let irritation seep into her words, didn't scoff at the ridiculousness of it all. Instead, she spoke in terms of facts, dates, and patterns. She provided delivery logs, time-stamped contractor emails contradicting Karen's interference, copies of county correspondence confirming the legitimacy of their vehicle and residence. When Rosalind asked about the photographs left anonymously in their mailbox, Evelyn placed them on the table without comment. Rosalind reviewed each piece carefully, her brow furrowing deeper with every new item. At the end of the hour, Rosalind closed the folder and said, "I can't make a legal ruling here, but I will recommend immediate suspension of any neighborhood enforcement actions targeting your address. Furthermore, I will formally request that all future complaints be reviewed through this office before action is taken." She didn't offer sympathy, only procedure, but in that moment, Evelyn didn't need sympathy. She needed acknowledgement. Recognition that what had been happening was not oversight. It was targeted misuse of informal authority. They left the building without ceremony, but something had shifted. Not just the administrative structure, but the emotional terrain. It was no longer just Evelyn and James fighting to defend their home. It was now documented, reviewed, and on record. And that, more than any angry confrontation, was the beginning of real consequence. However, the next move didn't come from Karen. It came from within the neighborhood, in a way neither of them expected. That evening, a man named Cliff, mid-60s, retired paramedic, known in the neighborhood for his standoffish demeanor and meticulously clean driveway, appeared at their door. James opened it cautiously. Cliff held out a manila envelope, his hand visibly trembling. "I shouldn't be here," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But I saw the flyers, the photos. The garbage people are spreading, and I can't stand by anymore. This isn't the first time she's done it." Evelyn took the envelope silently. Inside were old meeting notes, screenshots of group emails, even a digital voice recording from 2 years prior in which Karen instructed her volunteers to monitor non-conforming residents and document deviations. Most of it was ethically abhorrent, some legally dubious. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a cache of rot. Cliff didn't stay. He just said, "Good luck," and left without waiting for a response. That night, for the first time since the conflict began, Evelyn sat with James on the porch and said, "She's not just power-hungry. She's afraid of irrelevance. She's clinging to this role because it's all she has." James didn't argue. He'd seen the same desperation in her eyes that he'd seen in failing supervisors back when he worked corporate, people who couldn't accept that their authority was based on illusion, not substance. But illusion, when believed by enough people, becomes dangerous. and Karen's illusion had lasted for years. That illusion cracked the next morning. A new memo appeared in every mailbox in Silvermount Ridge, unsigned as usual. But this time, it wasn't a passive-aggressive reminder about fence height or approved landscaping. It was a direct accusation. Certain residents are using their positions to manipulate county resources for personal benefit. We urge all neighbors to stay vigilant. Abuse of power, even hidden behind politeness, is still abuse. It didn't mention Evelyn by name, but everyone understood. This was a last-ditch effort to reframe the narrative before it slipped completely out of Karen's control. It backfired. 2 residents approached Evelyn later that day, not to accuse, but to apologize. One said her husband had been pressured into attending Karen's unofficial planning meetings. Another confessed that he had signed a complaint letter without reading it fully, afraid of being labeled uncooperative. The illusion had cracked, and through the crack, truth was beginning to seep. Karen, however, wasn't finished. If she couldn't bury Evelyn quietly, she'd try to force a mistake. The next day, a white envelope arrived from the Office of County Oversight. An anonymous complaint had triggered a preliminary inquiry into Evelyn's use of official information during a private dispute. It was hollow and procedural, but it meant Evelyn had to file an official response, which she did, meticulously, cleanly, without anger. By the end of the week, the county formally dismissed the complaint, citing lack of evidence and no legal relevance. But that move had told Evelyn everything she needed to know. Karen wasn't just resisting. She was flailing, and soon she'd slip. Evelyn had long known that the most dangerous part of a power struggle wasn't the beginning, and not even the first major confrontation. It was the middle, the moment after a public blow has been struck, when the losing party still believes they can recover control if only they act boldly enough. That was where the real chaos began, when appearances cracked and desperation drove behavior. In that sense, she wasn't surprised when the next move came not through whispers or passive-aggressive notices, but with a sudden, deliberate attack masked as procedure. One Tuesday morning, at precisely 7:58 a.m., a city-marked vehicle pulled up in front of their property. The woman who stepped out was dressed professionally, clipboard in hand, and introduced herself as a zoning compliance officer from the county's Planning and Development Office. Her tone was even, but firm. "We've received a report that this property may be in violation of structural limits regarding auxiliary construction," she said, gesturing toward the small storage shed James had assembled behind the garage slab. Evelyn stepped out beside her husband, expression unreadable. "That shed predates our purchase. It was already on the property when we closed. Fully permitted," she said flatly. The officer nodded and made a note, but then added, "We'll need to confirm that. Also, I'm required to inspect the back patio. The report mentioned possible unregistered concrete expansion exceeding setback parameters." It was nonsense, of course, barely disguised harassment, but now dressed in the uniform of official inspection. Evelyn complied. She let the woman inspect every corner of their backyard, answered each question with calm clarity, and requested a copy of the original complaint. The officer, clearly aware of the situation's context, was professional but apologetic. "We don't usually act on anonymous complaints this fast, but this one came through with an internal code flag. It was marked Urgent Community Concern. That flag can only be applied by someone within a certified neighborhood management entity." Evelyn nodded once. "Let me guess. Karen Meeks." The woman didn't confirm it aloud, but her expression said enough. When the inspector left, Evelyn didn't go inside. She stood in the driveway for a long moment, then finally said, "She's trying to escalate it into a code violation, then use that to trigger a lien claim. Even if it doesn't stick, the process itself becomes punishment." James, who'd been watching from the porch, rubbed the back of his neck. "You said it before. This isn't about rules. It's about control." Evelyn nodded. And she's pushing faster now because she knows the clock is ticking. The ombudsman's next review is coming. She's running out of ways to act without being exposed. That afternoon, Evelyn filed her own paperwork, an official request to audit all recent county complaints filed under Silvermount Ridge addresses. She used a public records law to compel access. 2 days later, a document arrived via courier. 31 separate complaints, 16 of which targeted their property directly. But all were listed under Silvermount Community Liaison, Proxy. That title had no legal standing, but it was being accepted in clerical systems because no one had challenged its authority until now. That changed. Evelyn submitted the full list to Roslyn, the ombudsman, and to the county legal department with a summary indicating abuse of process and submission fraud. Still, she knew filing paperwork wasn't going to stop Karen now, not when her back was against the wall. People like Karen didn't retreat. They dug deeper. And dig she did. 2 nights later, just past 1 a.m., James awoke to the sound of metal clinking against glass. At first, he thought it might have been a branch, but the noise came again. Sharp, intentional. He rose, moved to the window, and saw 2 silhouettes near their gate. One held what looked like a flashlight. The other was fiddling with something on the fence. He called Evelyn without turning on the light. She was already halfway down the hall, sidearm drawn, but low at her side. She didn't approach with sirens or confrontation. She opened the door silently, stepped onto the porch, and called out with quiet authority, "Hands where I can see them." The flashlight beam dropped. 2 figures froze. One was the same man who had accompanied Karen that day months ago, a so-called enforcement officer, self-appointed. The other was a younger man in street clothes. "We were just checking the perimeter for safety concerns," the older man stammered. Evelyn's voice stayed flat. "You're not authorized to inspect anything on this property. You're not municipal. You're not licensed. You're trespassing." They left without argument, but not before the younger one muttered something under his breath. Evelyn logged the incident immediately and submitted it as part of her growing file. This time, though, she also contacted the sheriff's department, her department, and requested a deputy patrol car conduct nightly passes through Silvermount Ridge for the next 2 weeks, citing multiple trespassing attempts. Oh, not an overreach, a precaution. What followed was the community equivalent of a Cold War. Karen no longer showed her face, but her influence pulsed beneath every surface. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes around the neighborhood, printed on plain paper, claiming Evelyn was abusing her law enforcement connections to intimidate residents. They were unsigned, but the phrasing matched Karen's previous writing perfectly. Some neighbors ignored it, others didn't. One family, who had waved at James every day for months, began pulling their blinds when he walked by. Another couple crossed the street when Evelyn came home. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough to make the difference visible. Karen had lost the narrative in the system, so now she tried to control the social current. But her desperation betrayed her. 1 week later, an envelope arrived addressed not to Evelyn or James, but to the Office of the County Sheriff. Attention, Ethics Committee. Inside was a 3-page complaint alleging that Evelyn had used confidential information from her former department to orchestrate retaliatory investigations against Karen Meeks. The file contained no evidence, only accusations, but it forced a temporary internal review, a process Evelyn had gone through before, but never under such absurd pretenses. She submitted her full record, all communications, and stepped back. "Let them audit it," she told James. "I've done everything by the book." But James saw what it cost her to say that. The bitterness of having her integrity questioned not by criminals, but by petty suburban tyrants. Still, the machine moved. Interviews were conducted, files examined, colleagues called in. Every step took time, and in that time, Karen moved again. This time, she struck financially. Without warning, The Coopers received a notice from the local tax assessor indicating that a formal property reassessment had been requested on their home, citing recent unauthorized improvements and potential changes in structural usage. The EDIP request came again from Silvermount Community Liaison, flagged for review by a contractor linked to Karen's brother-in-law. The reassessment could raise their taxes by thousands annually, all based on unverified manufactured claims. Evelyn responded with a sworn affidavit, supported by contractor receipts and permit records, but the process had already begun. It would take weeks to resolve, even longer to correct. That was the tactic. Not to win, to drain, to outlast. James hit his breaking point that night. Not in an outburst, but in a quiet decision. "I'm tired of playing their game," he said. "She thinks we're just another problem to wear down. Let's stop defending. Let's make her explain." The next day, they hired a private civil attorney, not to sue, but to initiate a formal discovery request against the group Karen was operating under. The goal wasn't money. It was disclosure, paperwork, proof. Once discovery began, Karen's records would be subpoenaed. Her emails, meeting notes, financial documents, all open to scrutiny. Karen responded with the only move left to her. She showed up. At their house. Late one evening, just before sunset, a knock came at the door. James opened it. Karen stood there, not smiling, not angry, just hollow. Her eyes were flat, her expression blank. "This needs to stop," she said. "You're ruining the integrity of this neighborhood." James stared at her. "We're ruining nothing. We're asking questions." Karen's jaw twitched. "You don't belong here. You think that badge makes you immune? That people won't see what you are?" Evelyn appeared beside him, calm, steady. "What exactly do you think I am, Karen?" There was no answer. Just a long silence before Karen turned and walked away, back to her house, back to the castle built of pretense and unspoken pressure that was now crumbling from the inside. The next day, an anonymous tip was submitted to the County Fraud Division, not from the Coopers, from someone else. It alleged misuse of funds in the community discretionary budget, a small account Karen managed unofficially. Within 48 hours, an audit was initiated. By the end of the week, Karen Meeks was under formal investigation. And still, Evelyn didn't gloat. She simply resumed her morning coffee on the porch, eyes steady, voice quiet when she said to James, "Now the real process begins." It didn't take long for the wheels of formal investigation to begin grinding. Slow at first, but inevitable in their direction. What had started as a whisper campaign and vague procedural harassment was now transforming into something far more dangerous for Karen Meeks, a legal process she couldn't manipulate through charm or thinly veiled threats. The complaint filed with the County Fraud Division triggered an audit of discretionary funds collected for community projects under Karen's direction, which, as it turned out, had been managed entirely off the books for the last 4 years. The money came from informal contributions, pressure disguised as neighborly encouragement, and voluntary neighborhood beautification dues that hadn't been accounted for by any official financial body. The total sum wasn't staggering by city standards, but for a residential pocket like Silvermount Ridge, it was enough. Enough to ask questions, enough to demand records, enough to knock on doors. County officials began interviews under the guise of routine neighborhood review, but those who'd once kept quiet, out of fear, loyalty, or simple resignation, began talking. Evelyn heard it all not from the front lines, but through the quiet echo chamber of consequence. A former neighbor whose husband had once done landscaping work for Karen confided that he'd been paid under the table to install a fence that later became the reason for a property dispute with another resident. A retired accountant came forward with old records of supply orders billed through a now-defunct HOA-styled group Karen had created years ago. Receipts that included patio furniture for her own home listed as community event materials. None of it was catastrophic on its own, but taken together, it was a mosaic of deceit, arrogance, and misuse of soft power. And, most damningly, it was all built on the assumption that no one would ever push back. Evelyn didn't have to push anymore. The process had caught momentum, and with each new detail uncovered, it moved faster. Still, she remained careful, providing information only when requested, attending hearings when summoned, but never leading the charge. She had promised herself from the beginning that she would not become the villain of someone else's script. She would not be the angry badge-wielding sheriff on a vendetta. The power of restraint, she understood, could cut deeper than aggression, especially when the person unraveling couldn't comprehend how their own actions were the source of their downfall. James, watching the dominoes fall, had to restrain himself from premature celebration. He, too, had suffered through months of targeted disruption, had watched as his wife was vilified and his name whispered like a contagion. But now the silence of those who'd once avoided them had turned into nods, quiet acknowledgments, and small gestures of reconciliation. No one openly apologized. Pride was a stubborn thing, but it was enough. Then came the summons. Karen Meeks was formally requested to appear before the county's regulatory board for an inquiry into financial misrepresentation, misuse of influence, and unauthorized initiation of civil actions under false pretense. It was not a criminal trial, not yet, but it was the final crack in the structure she'd built around herself. For the first time since they had moved in, Evelyn saw Karen in a position she had never imagined, sitting alone, across from a panel of municipal officials, no clipboard in hand, no camera, no staged confidence. Just a stack of files in front of her and no script to read from. Evelyn sat in the audience, not as a witness, but as a citizen. She said nothing, did nothing. She only watched. Karen's answers were rehearsed but fraying at the edges. Her voice, normally so sharp and confident, now wavered under the weight of administrative precision. When asked about the discretionary fund, she claimed it was informal, a neighborhood tradition. When asked for accounting records, she fumbled. When pressed on the numerous complaints filed under her name through non-legitimate channels, she attempted to shift blame onto a rotating committee of helpers, none of whom had been mentioned in any previous filings. It unraveled quickly after that. The panel didn't attack her, they didn't have to. They simply let her speak, and in doing so she revealed the fragility of her power. The hearing ended without a final verdict, but everyone in the room understood the outcome. Karen would be suspended from all formal or informal neighborhood leadership pending further investigation. The discretionary fund was frozen. And perhaps most notably, her influence, unofficial though it had always been, was now publicly and legally revoked. She left the chamber alone, her face tight, her steps rigid. There were no supporters waiting for her, no rally of neighbors to affirm her self-appointed authority, just silence and closed doors. But the culmination wasn't just administrative. It came in the days that followed, in the shifts that couldn't be filed in court or documented in memos. Residents who had once blindly followed began to disconnect. The woman who had managed the community bulletin quietly resigned. The so-called neighborhood watch dissolved. The men Karen had called her enforcement team disappeared into their garages and backyard projects, no longer willing to be seen on her behalf. Small gestures returned. A pie left on the Cooper's porch without a note, a wave from across the street, a shared rake during fall cleanup. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even reconciliation. It was an admission, quiet but honest, that they had allowed something to go too far and had watched it become malignant without speaking up. Evelyn didn't take joy in it. She didn't smile at Karen's fall or gloat in the neighborhood's shifting loyalty. Instead, she resumed the quiet routine she'd once hoped would define this chapter of their life. Morning coffee on the porch. Afternoon walks with James along the wooded path behind their lot. Evenings spent reading instead of drafting formal statements. And for the first time since they arrived, she left the SUV parked in the driveway without a second thought. No notes appeared. No inspections followed. The air itself felt different, lighter, not because the threat was gone, but because the illusion of invulnerability had been shattered. Karen stayed. She didn't sell her home, didn't vanish. But her presence became quieter, her reach truncated. No more flyers, no more meetings. She became just another resident, one whose voice no longer commanded silence or fear. And though she passed the Coopers from time to time, she never spoke, never made eye contact. That suited Evelyn fine. Power didn't need to be asserted to be recognized. Real strength, she knew, didn't come from control. It came from knowing when to act, how to endure, and, most importantly, when to let the system she had once served run its course, even when it was flawed, because believing in process meant trusting it to eventually do what it was designed to do. That night, as the sun dipped low behind the trees and the last of the summer light stretched across the lawn, James sat beside her on the porch and asked, "Do you think she ever really believed she was doing the right thing?" Evelyn thought for a long time before answering. "I think she believed she couldn't be wrong. That's what made her dangerous." James nodded, and they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that came not from victory, but from the quiet confirmation that they had held their ground without becoming what they stood against. Autumn arrived with the quiet precision of a well-timed ending. Cool mornings, gold-leafed trees, and the scent of firewood curling through the air like punctuation after a long, difficult sentence. Silvermount Ridge no longer felt like contested ground, not because it had transformed into a utopia, but because the conflict that once defined every shadow and whisper had receded into memory. Karen Meeks remained in her home, but her presence was no longer the gravitational center of neighborhood politics. Her influence, once enforced through implication and fear, had faded into something brittle and inconsequential. The audit was still ongoing, but the bulk of its impact had already settled in the form of revoked control, shattered trust, and community fatigue. No one wanted another Karen, and no one, it seemed, was willing to let anyone become one again. Evelyn found herself exhaling more easily each day. The tension she had carried in her shoulders, the instinct to scan every parked car or unfamiliar figure, gradually released its hold. Her leave of absence, once intended as a temporary reprieve, had taken on new shape. Still unofficial, but now under serious consideration for permanence. The sheriff's department had reached out more than once, offering quiet overtures about return, support, even promotion. But Evelyn had declined each time, not out of bitterness, but clarity. She had proven something to herself during those months, that identity need not be tied to a title, and that her capacity to act, to protect, to endure, was not contained within the walls of a department office or the shine of a badge. What she had done in Silvermount Ridge had not required rank, only resolve. James, too, had shifted. The man who once paced the property line with calculations in his mind now walked it less out of caution and more out of habit, enjoying the contours of the land rather than checking for violations. His relationship with Evelyn had grown deeper in the silence that followed the storm. They no longer needed to speak about every moment of stress because they had survived something unspoken, together. Their conversations turned to future plans. A greenhouse for Evelyn's herbs, a woodworking shed for James, perhaps even hosting a small neighborhood gathering in the spring. Not as a declaration of forgiveness, but as a gesture of normalcy reclaimed. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Not official, not anonymous, but handwritten on cream-colored stationery. It came from a neighbor neither of them had spoken with directly before, a middle-aged woman named Lorraine, who lived 3 houses down. The letter was short, simple, and unmistakably sincere. You didn't owe any of us anything, but you stood your ground when we wouldn't. I'm sorry it took so long for people to see what was happening. If there's ever anything you need, please know some of us are paying attention now. Evelyn read it in silence, then folded it once and placed it in the drawer by the kitchen window. So... It was the only apology she would receive, and it was enough. Weeks passed, and eventually the county issued a final statement. The discretionary fund managed by Karen Meeks had been deemed non-compliant and was to be dissolved. No criminal charges would be filed, but restitution was required for misallocated expenses. Karen paid the penalty, quietly, without appeal. No one celebrated. No one gloated. Silvermount Ridge simply moved on. That was the nature of neighborhoods. When chaos ended, people returned to lawn care, morning walks, and weather talk, as though the breach had never happened. But Evelyn and James knew better. Beneath the surface, something had changed. The illusion of benign control, once so accepted, had been shattered. And in its place, something more resilient had formed. Not unity, perhaps, but awareness. That was enough. One evening, not long before winter settled in for good, Evelyn stepped onto the porch just as Karen was walking past with her small terrier. The two women locked eyes for the first time in months. Karen's expression was blank, neither anger nor apology, only the exhaustion of someone who had been forced to live without the performance that once defined her. She gave a small nod. Evelyn returned it, nothing more. No words, just acknowledgement. That was all that remained, and all that was necessary. Karen continued walking, and Evelyn went back inside. The conflict was over. There would be no dramatic final confrontation, no redemption arc, no handshake of closure. Just quiet. And that, perhaps, was the most fitting end of all, not in spectacle, but in stillness. Because real justice didn't always come with headlines or grand declarations. Sometimes it came in the form of limits restored, illusions broken, and people finally remembering what it meant to live without fear. Evelyn didn't need to win to feel whole. She only needed to live free. And now, at last, she did.